What would you do if, at the most fragile moment of your life, you were forced to confront the biggest ghost from your past? Sarah Collins, a dedicated teacher, lived for years haunted by painful memories of her abusive father. But when her heart stopped during emergency surgery, she found herself in a place between life and death, where an unexpected reunion awaited her. Is it possible to forgive someone who hurt you so much? And how will this near-death experience transform everything she believes about herself and the world? What secrets from the past were revealed to Sarah in this moment of transition? How can such an intense experience change someone's life forever? If you've ever wondered what happens when we're on the brink of the afterlife, or how it's possible to find redemption where you least expect it, this story will capture your attention from beginning to end. Get ready for a journey of faith, hope, and miracles. I'm Anthony Bennett and welcome to my near-death experience channel. Let's listen to the story together. Sarah Collins, a dedicated 42-year-old teacher, lived in Seattle, Washington, where she devoted herself entirely to teaching and caring for her elderly mother, Ellen. Despite her calm and collected appearance, Sarah carried deep emotional wounds caused by her tumultuous childhood. His father, Robert, who passed away 10 years ago, was an authoritarian and abusive figure, both emotionally and physically. He controlled every aspect of family life with an iron fist, leaving Sarah and her mother always on the edge of fear and insecurity. Sarah grew up witnessing her mother's silent suffering. Ellen bore her husband's abuse with a resignation that Sarah could never understand. For Sarah, her childhood memories were dark, marked by screaming, arguments, and a constant feeling of helplessness. She often hid in her room, trying to escape the reality that surrounded her. Despite this, Sarah managed to excel in her studies, finding in books a refuge from the harsh family reality. Sarah's relationship with her father was complicated. He never praised her, always expecting more from her, as if nothing he did was good enough. This created a deep feeling of inadequacy in Sarah that she carried into adulthood. Even after Robert's death, Sarah couldn't free herself from the shadow he left on her life. The anger and resentment she felt towards him only grew over time, preventing her from finding inner peace. Despite the difficulties, Sarah built a successful career as an English teacher. She was loved by her students and respected by her colleagues. However, his personal life remained an emotional minefield. She never married and avoided intimate relationships, fearing that the same abusive patterns from her childhood would be repeated. The only person with whom he maintained a close bond was his mother, although even that relationship was marked by unresolved tensions. Ellen, on the other hand, seemed to have found a way to make peace with the past. She rarely spoke about Robert, and when she did, it was with a strange mixture of sadness and compassion. Sarah, on the other hand, couldn't understand how her mother could have forgiven the man who mistreated them for so many years. This contrast between the two women created an emotional barrier between mother and daughter, making any attempt at true rapprochement difficult. In recent months, Sarah has begun to feel the effects of stress accumulated over the years. She suffered from insomnia, frequent headaches, and fatigue that never seemed to go away. I attributed these symptoms to overwork, ignoring signs that something more serious could be wrong. Her worried mother insisted that Sarah see a doctor, but she always found an excuse to postpone the appointment. It was only when he fainted at school during a meeting that he realized he could no longer ignore his condition. Sarah was rushed to hospital, where doctors carried out a series of tests to determine the cause of her collapse. She felt weak and confused, unable to fully understand what was happening. Doctors diagnosed a serious infection that had spread rapidly throughout his body, compromising several of his organs. The news came as a shock to Sarah, who had always considered herself healthy and strong. The reality of her situation began to set in, bringing with it a sense of dread. Doctors explained that the infection was advanced and that emergency surgery would be necessary to try to control the damage. The prognosis was uncertain, and Sarah was told there was a real chance she would not survive the procedure. Panic took over her, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt completely helpless. The control she had always tried to maintain over her life was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her mother, Ellen, was by her side, trying to be strong for both of them. Ellen held Sarah's hand, offering words of comfort that actually seemed more aimed at herself. "You're going to be okay, sweetheart," Ellen whispered, though her eyes betrayed the fear she tried to hide. Sarah looked at her mother, feeling a mix of love and guilt. She knew that if something happened to her, her mother would be devastated. The idea of leaving her mother alone in the world was almost unbearable for Sarah. As preparations for surgery were made, Sarah began to reflect on her life. Thoughts of regret began to surface, things she wished she had done differently, words she should have said, and especially the never-resolved relationship with her father. She realized that despite all her professional success, there were aspects of her personal life that she never really faced. The resentment she still felt towards her father was a burden she carried silently, but now seemed unbearable. Sarah tried to push those thoughts away, focusing on what was to come. The thought of facing emergency surgery was terrifying, but the fear of death was even worse. She wasn't ready to leave, not when there were so many unresolved issues in her life. Sarah has always been a practical woman who faced challenges head-on, but at that moment, vulnerability overwhelmed her. She didn't know what would happen next, and that uncertainty was overwhelming. As she was wheeled into the operating room, Sarah looked at her mother one last time. Ellen held his hands, telling him to be strong. But Sarah, feeling the pressure of the anesthesia starting to take effect, knew it wasn't just about strength. She felt like she was on the brink of something much bigger than she could comprehend, something that was about to change her life forever. When darkness finally enveloped her, Sarah surrendered to the unknown, not knowing if she would ever wake up again. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was no longer in the operating room. Instead, he found himself in a completely different place, a long corridor lit by a soft, welcoming light. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but everything seemed incredibly real. The feeling of peace that enveloped her was like nothing she had ever experienced before. Looking around, she realized she wasn't alone. At the end of the hallway, a familiar figure began to form, his father, Robert. The sight of her father, a man she hadn't seen since the day of his funeral, made her heart race. He looked younger, healthier than he had in his later years. Despite the softness of the light around her, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She never expected to see him again, much less in a place like that. His presence brought to the surface a wave of conflicting emotions, anger, fear, sadness, and a deep pain she thought she had buried long ago. Robert smiled at her, but the smile brought no comfort. Instead, it seemed like a mask hiding something darker. "Sarah," he said, his voice echoing in the space around him. "We are finally together again." Sarah felt her throat tighten. His words scared her. How could he speak so casually, as if nothing had happened? As if he hadn't caused her and her mother so much suffering? "Why are you here?" she managed to ask, her voice shaking with emotion. "I'm here to help you," he replied calmly. "To guide you through what's to come." Sarah took a step back, instinctively moving away from him. She didn't want his help. She didn't want anything from him. All he represented in his life was pain and suffering. "I don't need your help," she said, trying to sound firm, but her voice broke. "You didn't care about me when I was alive. Why would you now?" Robert sighed, as if expecting that answer. "I know I failed you, Sarah. But now I'm here to try to fix what I can." His words confused her. Part of Sarah wanted to scream, to accuse him of everything he'd done, of all the suffering he'd caused. But another part of her, a part she didn't want to acknowledge, was curious, almost hopeful. What could he say that would make a difference now? You destroyed our lives, she began, her voice full of emotion. You made our house a living hell. Why should I listen to you now? Robert didn't back down. He stood still, letting his words echo between them before responding. I know I hurt you, he said finally. And I know I can't change the past. But I'm here to help you move forward, to help you find peace. Sarah wanted to laugh, but the sound didn't come out. Peace? How could she find peace with him, the source of so much pain, telling him what to do? But something in his voice, in the way he spoke, made her stop and think. Perhaps, in some way, this meeting was necessary. Perhaps, to move forward, she needed to face the demons of her past, and he was the biggest of them all. Sarah felt her anger rising, an old fire rekindling in her chest. You have no idea what you did, she said, stepping forward, facing her father. You broke us. You broke Mom. And now you want me to just forgive you? Robert looked at her with an expression she didn't recognize. Was it sadness? Remorse? She didn't know for sure. I understand you feel that way, he replied, his voice calm, almost resigned. But the hate you carry is destroying you. It's stopping you from living the life you deserve. His words hit her like a punch in the gut. Sarah knew there was truth in them. She had spent years carrying this weight, this anger that was eating her up inside. But forgive him? How could she do this? You never loved me, she accused, her voice full of bitterness. You never loved Mom. All it did was destroy everything around it. And now you expect me to forgive you? Robert closed his eyes for a moment, as if her words really hurt him. When he opened them again, there was a deep sadness in his eyes. I wasn't a good father, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I was so lost in my own pain and anger that I didn't see what I was doing to you. But I'm here now because I want you to have the chance to live without this burden. Sarah felt tears start to roll down her face. She hated crying, hated showing any sign of weakness, especially in front of him. But something inside her was breaking, a barrier she had put up long ago. I don't know if I can, she said, her voice breaking. I don't know if I'm strong enough to forgive. And if I forgive, what will be left of me? Who am I going to be? Robert stepped forward, reaching for her hand, but Sarah didn't take it. She wasn't ready for this, not yet. You will be free, he said simply. Free to be who you really are, without the weight of the past holding you back. I know it's hard, but I also know that you are stronger than you think. His words stirred something deep inside Sarah. She was always proud of her strength, her ability to overcome adversity. But now, faced with the prospect of forgiving the man who had caused so much suffering, she felt more vulnerable than ever. What if I don't make it? She asked, her voice thick with uncertainty. What if I can't forgive you? Robert smiled sadly. So you continue to carry that weight, he said. But you don't have to. The choice is yours. Sarah felt a mixture of emotions that made her dizzy. Part of her wanted to scream at him, reject everything he was saying. But another part, a part she didn't know existed, desperately wanted to believe he was right. That maybe, just maybe, she could break free from this cycle of pain and resentment. I'll try, she said finally, her words coming out haltingly. I don't know how, but I'll try. And with those words, Sarah felt something inside her begin to change. Sarah stood there, staring at her father, feeling the enormity of what she had just said. Trying to forgive him was something she had never considered before. For years, she had nursed her anger as a way to protect herself, an armor against the pain he caused. But now, this armor felt too heavy to carry. Robert's words, although difficult to hear, had touched a part of her that longed for peace, for relief from the burden she had carried for so long. Robert seemed to notice the change in Sarah. He took another step towards her, but stopped when he saw the hesitation in her eyes. "I know it won't be easy," he said, his voice soft. "Forgiveness doesn't happen all at once. It's a process, a choice you make every day. And it's not to absolve me, Sarah. It's so you can free yourself." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to absorb what he was saying. She knew he was right, but still, the idea of forgiving him seemed so far away, so impossible. "I don't know if I can forgive you completely," she admitted, her voice shaking. "But maybe I can start trying." Robert nodded, a sad yet hopeful smile on his face. "That's all I could ask for," he said. "The simple act of trying is a big step. And in doing so, you will begin to heal." Sarah felt a lightness begin to creep into her chest, as if, as she spoke those words, a small part of the burden was beginning to dissolve. She never imagined that forgiveness could be something so complex, something that could be done in stages. Sarah has always thought of forgiveness as a final decision, a definitive turning point. But now, she saw that it was more of a process, a journey that would require patience and self-compassion. And maybe, just maybe, it was a journey she was ready to begin. "I'm still scared," she confessed, looking at her father with a new understanding. "But I want to try. For me. Not for you." Robert smiled again, this time with a little more light in his eyes. "That's all I could want for you," he said. "May you find the peace you deserve. I will be with you, every step you take, even if you can't see me." His words echoed inside her, bringing a strange sense of comfort. Sarah knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, she felt like she was no longer alone. She had begun to take the first step toward healing. As she took it all in, Sarah began to feel her surroundings change. The soft light that surrounded her began to intensify, and she felt as if she was being pulled back, away from her father. She tried to fight the feeling, trying to stay a little longer, but she knew it was futile. "I'm coming back," she realized, her heart beating faster. "I'm coming back to life." And, with this realization, Sarah closed her eyes, letting herself be carried away by the light that surrounded her. When Sarah opened her eyes again, the soft light of the hallway was replaced by the cold, bright lights of the operating room. She heard the sound of the monitors around her, felt the oxygen mask on her face and the voices of the doctors and nurses echoing around her. For a moment, she felt disoriented, unable to understand where she was or what had happened. But then, the memory of her encounter with her father began to return, and she realized that she was back in the world of the living. She felt a mixture of relief and sadness as she realized that the experience she had, surreal as it was now in the past. Sarah blinked, trying to focus her eyes, and saw her mother's figure beside the bed, holding her hand tightly. Ellen looked exhausted, but relieved to see her daughter wake up. "Sarah, you're back," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Sarah tried to smile, but her body was still weak, and she could barely lift her hand to hold her mother's. Sarah wanted to tell her mother everything that had happened, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain something so inexplicable? How could she describe the encounter she had with her father, the forgiveness she had begun to offer? Instead, she just looked at her mother, feeling a renewed connection, a silent understanding that somehow everything had changed. Sarah knew she would have to process all of this, but for now, she was just grateful to be alive. The following days were difficult. Sarah was weak and took a while to regain her strength. But while his body recovered, his mind was busy revisiting the experience he had during surgery. Every detail was burned into his memory, the hallway, the light, his father's words. She knew that this was not a simple dream. It was something more, something she still couldn't fully explain. But somehow he felt it had been an opportunity, a chance to correct the course of his life. She began to think more deeply about what it meant to forgive. What his father had said made sense, even if it was difficult to accept. Forgiveness was not about him, but about her. It was about letting go of the past, about not allowing anger and resentment to continue to define who she was. Sarah knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. She still had a lot of work to do, both in terms of healing her wounds and coming to terms with her father's memories. As Sarah recovered physically, she decided she would take advantage of this second chance. She would start working on herself, facing the emotions she had avoided for so long. And eventually, she would talk to her mother about what had happened. I knew Ellen would understand, that in some way it could help her mother find closure too. But for now, Sarah focused on getting stronger, knowing the real challenge was yet to come. As the days passed and Sarah continued to recover, she began to reflect deeply on the concept of forgiveness. Never before had she thought about it so introspectively. Forgiving her father wasn't something she could do right away, but her experience during surgery made her realize that forgiveness was more about personal liberation than about absolving someone of their faults. This new understanding led her to reconsider many of the emotions she had been repressing over the years. Sarah realized that the forgiveness she sought was not just for her father, but also for herself. She needed to forgive herself for allowing the past to control so many aspects of her life. The resentment he carried was a barrier that prevented any form of happiness or true peace. Recognizing this was painful, but also liberating. Sarah felt that, for the first time, she was on the right path to healing the emotional wounds that had plagued her since childhood. This internal journey led her to realize that her relationship with her mother needed repair. Ellen had always been a resilient woman, and Sarah finally understood that her mother's forgiveness of Robert was not weakness, but a strength that she herself had yet to cultivate. Sarah began to look at her mother with new eyes, admiring her ability to leave the past behind and move forward. This inspired her to try to do the same, even though she knew the road would be long and difficult. Sarah decided she wouldn't rush the process. She knew that forgiveness, both for her father and for herself, would need to be achieved little by little, with patience and understanding. She began exploring ways to deal with her emotions, seeking help from books, therapy, and, eventually, heart-to-heart conversations with her mother. Each small victory on the path to forgiveness was celebrated internally, and Sarah began to feel a growing lightness in her heart. The decision to forgive did not mean forgetting what had happened. Sarah knew the scars from her childhood would always be there, but now they would serve as reminders of her strength rather than sources of pain. She began talking more openly about her past, both with her mother and close friends, and found that sharing her story was an essential part of the healing process. The more he talked about his feelings, the easier it became to deal with them. As she continued to reflect on what she had learned, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in her everyday life. She felt calmer, more centered, and less prone to impulsive reactions. The anger that was always lurking, ready to explode, had diminished significantly. Sarah began to appreciate the little things in life again, the quiet moments with her mother, the smiles of her students, and even the beauty of a sunny morning. Over time, Sarah decided it was time to rebuild her relationship with her mother. They had always had a strong bond, but the silence about the past had created a barrier between them. Now, Sarah felt she was ready to break that barrier and build something new, based on honesty and mutual understanding. One night, while they were having tea in the kitchen, Sarah finally opened up to her mother about what had happened during the surgery. Ellen listened silently as Sarah described meeting Robert, his words, and how it had affected her. When Sarah finished, there were tears in both their eyes. "I always knew he hurt you a lot," Ellen said softly, holding Sarah's hand. "And I'm sorry I didn't do more to protect you. But I'm so proud of you for being strong enough to face this now." Those words meant more to Sarah than anything else. It was the first step towards a new phase in their relationship. From that moment on, Sarah and Ellen began to talk more openly about the past. It wasn't easy, and the conversations were often painful, but they both knew it was necessary. Sarah began to better understand her mother's choices and the strength Ellen needed to survive that marriage. On the other hand, Ellen also began to see Sarah as a strong and independent woman who, despite everything, managed to build a successful life. These conversations helped Sarah see her mother from a new perspective. Ellen was not just a victim of the past, but a survivor, just like Sarah. Over time, Sarah began to forgive not only her father, but also herself for any resentment she had harbored toward her mother. She realized that forgiveness was a form of release, not just for herself, but for Ellen as well. They began spending more time together, rediscovering the joy of being in each other's company. The relationship between mother and daughter became stronger and healthier. Sarah felt like she had rediscovered a part of herself that had been lost for a long time. The love and understanding that grew between them became the basis of a new life, where the past no longer had the power to control them. They began to create new memories, traveling together and sharing experiences that previously seemed impossible due to the shadow of the past. Meanwhile, Sarah also started opening up to other people. She reconnected with friends she had distanced herself from and began to cultivate new friendships. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed people to get close to her. She was no longer afraid of getting hurt because she now knew she had the strength to handle any challenge that came her way. Sarah's life was transforming in ways she never imagined, and it all started with that near-death experience that made her confront her greatest fear. The near-death experience not only made Sarah confront her past fears and traumas, but it also led her to rediscover life in a completely new way. She began to notice the beauty in the little things that previously went unnoticed. Each day became an opportunity to live more fully and authentically. Sarah decided she no longer wanted to live in the past. She wanted to create a future that reflected the woman she was becoming. At work, Sarah began to become more involved with her students, not just as a teacher, but as a mentor who understood the challenges many of them faced. She began sharing parts of her story with her closest students, using her own experience as a way to help them overcome their difficulties. This created a deeper bond between her and her students, who now saw her not just as a teacher, but as a source of inspiration and support. Sarah also began to explore new passions and interests that she previously didn't have the time or energy to pursue. She enrolled in art classes, something she always wanted to do but never allowed herself to. Painting became a way to express her emotions, a way to process everything she had experienced and continue the healing she had begun in the hospital. Each brushstroke was a way of releasing the tension she carried, and the vibrant colors she used reflected the new life she was building. Another significant change was the way Sarah began to take care of herself. She realized that, in order to remain strong and healthy, both physically and emotionally, she needed to prioritize herself. Sarah started meditating daily, found time to exercise, and most importantly, learned to say no when necessary. She stopped feeling guilty about putting her needs first, understanding that by taking care of herself, she was also improving the lives of everyone around her. The relationship with his mother continued to strengthen. They traveled together, laughed more, and shared stories they had never told each other. Sarah realized that despite everything, there was so much love between them, a love that had been stifled by years of pain but was now blossoming again. These new memories became as important as anything from the past, and Sarah treasured every moment with her mother. Meanwhile, his father's memory began to transform. He was no longer just the villain of her story, but a more complex figure, with flaws and regrets that Sarah was beginning to understand. The forgiveness she offered did not erase that happened, but it allowed her to move forward with less weight on her shoulders. Now, instead of avoiding thinking about him, Sarah has begun to see her father as a part of her past that helped shape her into the person she is today. Sarah's near-death experience in the hospital was the turning point in her life. She emerged from that moment with a new perspective, one that valued life in a deeper, more meaningful way. The forgiveness process she began with her father was not easy, but it was necessary for her healing and growth. Now, Sarah felt like she was ready to begin a new chapter in her life, one that wasn't defined by the traumas of the past, but by the possibilities of the future. Sarah began to make plans for the future, something she had avoided for a long time. For the first time, she considered the idea of pursuing a romantic relationship, something she had always avoided for fear of repeating the patterns of her childhood. With her mother supporting her, Sarah began to explore this new possibility with caution and hope. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was willing to try, knowing that she now had the strength to deal with anything that came her way. At work, Sarah continued to be a positive and influential presence in the lives of her students. She became involved in new projects at the school focused on student mental health and well-being, using her own experience as inspiration. Her colleagues noticed the change in her, and many reached out to her for advice and support. Sarah became a living example of resilience and overcoming, and this new reputation brought with it new professional opportunities. Despite all the positive changes, Sarah knew the healing process was ongoing. There were days when old emotions would resurface, but now she had the tools and support she needed to deal with them. Sarah no longer saw these emotions as enemies, but as parts of herself that needed care and attention. Over time, she learned to embrace these emotions, treating herself with the kindness and compassion she previously reserved only for others. As she reflected on her journey, Sarah realized that meeting her father during his near-death experience was a gift. Not because he was forgiven, but because she was freed. Now, she could live fully, without the shackles of the past. The experience gave her the chance to rewrite her story, and Sarah was determined to do so in the best way possible. With a new outlook on life and renewed strength, Sarah was ready for whatever came next. She knew the future was uncertain, but instead of fearing it, she embraced it. Life, with all its ups and downs, was something she was eager to live to the fullest. Sarah Collins had finally found the peace she had been searching for, and was ready to write the next chapter of her life with joy, love, and purpose.